Hi there, this is Catherine Dubberly, the Answer Lady, and today I made a mistake in my knitting. I've got some stitches running on the edge of a piece of work, and I have to fix them. So I thought I would show you how I would go about doing that. This is a useful technique for when you make mistakes, but also if for some reason you need to remove your work from the board, maybe to swatch something else, maybe to pack the board away, who knows, but you need to remove it and you want to save it. So I'm going to show you how to remove your work, possibly fix the error, and rehang your work on the board. What I use for this purpose is double point knitting needles. I think it is the simplest way, but there are other ways. You can use plain knitting needles in the same manner that you see me working, or you can use a yarn needle with a long strand of yarn, preferably thicker and a different color from your main yarn to make things easier, or you can use a piece of wire. Of these, I think the wire is the least good choice because the wire sometimes snags on the yarn. Since I have double point needles, and that's my favorite, that's what I'm using here. Go down one side of the knitting board, picking up each stitch and placing it on the point of the double point needle. Make sure that you don't extend the point too far because it will get in the way. It's actually not possible to load the stitch if the point is too far out. On the other hand, if you are too conservative and back the point off, you're going to drop the stitches you've already picked up. So there's a happy medium that you've got to get a feel for. When one side is complete, turn the board and use the other one of the needles to pick up the stitches along the other side. If you see that you've split a stitch, this is a good time to stop, back up, and reload it as you have seen me do already. There were some decreases at the edges on the row just knitted, so some of the needles have 2 stitches on them, and we need to make sure that we load both stitches in such a case. When every stitch seems to be loaded, take a good look down the row, make sure you didn't miss anything, and then pull the work gently off of the boards through the top. Wiggle it around. On this particular board, it's quite easy to avoid catching on the needles, but on a board with pointier needles, you need to be careful about pulling straight out so that you don't snag your knitting work on the needle. So there we go. The work is free, it's safe, stitches can't run, and now I can find and repair my mistake. I'm going to use a latch tool to repair my mistake. You can also use a crochet hook. A latch tool is just like a crochet hook, but it has a little hinged closure on it. This is something that machine knitters use, and as you know, I'm an avid machine knitter, so I have these, and you can order one from somebody who sells machine knitting tools because it's a little bit easier to manipulate and keep your stitches on. A crochet hook is faster for crocheting, but where things are pulling and tugging on your stitches, the latch tool is a help. Anyway, either one will work, and you have to find where the stitch was dropped, put it on your hook, and then chain up the ladder where the stitches have run down. You have to look around in double knitting so that you can find it, but it's fairly obvious once you get the hang of it. Subject for another video. If you decide you want a latch tool, a bulky version is most appropriate for most of our knitting board work, and I do sell some of them on my website. I could have stitched down my latched up stitches next to the decreases, which would hide my misdeeds pretty well, but because this is a model garment, I decided to be fussy and unravel it and rehang the work at the point below the mistake. Now that it's down to the point that I want, I'm going to reload each side of stitches onto one of the needles. Make sure to keep the batches separate. One board stitches go on one needle, the other board side stitches go on the other needle. The most important thing to remember here is not to tug on the stitches, because as you load the first side, they could pull and make the second side stitches get smaller and smaller and even disappear and run. So don't make it harder on yourself to load the second side than you have to. Be very gentle using the needle point only to load the first side, and then you won't have any trouble finding the stitches for the second side. If you do happen to drop one, you will see, if you observe carefully, that this has happened, and latch up the dropped bar on the ladder with your crochet hook or latch tool before loading the stitch. I find it best during this part of the project not to worry too much about how you load the stitch. I mean the direction in which you load the stitch. The stitches might become twisted as they flip around and you're loading them on the tip of the double-pointed needle, but this will be more obvious and easier to fix, and we'll have greater access to these stitches once they're back on the board. At that point we can lift them and turn them with our hooks. So I don't get too fussy about it while reloading them onto the knitting needles. Once all the stitches are safely reloaded, give the knitting a downward tug to enlarge and set those stitches, which will make our next step easier. Now slide the knitting down from the top between the two knitting boards, align it where you want it to be on the board, and start loading stitches from where they are held on the circular needles back onto the pegs or needles of the knitting board. You'll see me starting work in the upper left hand point on your screen. Now at first it's very easy, but as you work, the stitches, which have been compressed a little bit to fit onto the knitting needles, need to stretch out again to fit onto the knitting board, and you'll have to work them along the knitting needle and sometimes retract the wooden or metal points of your knitting needles as you hang stitches so as to get enough room to work and stretch the stitches so that they rehang nicely on the board. Sometimes I find it most convenient to hang part of one side and then part of the other side so as to have the sides stretching evenly, because your knitting is one piece of work although you're hanging stitches on two boards, and the stretchiness works out better this way. Just don't forget to go back and finish the first board that you worked on. It would be horrible to pull out your needles and discover that you've dropped several stitches. Now at a certain point I realized I had missed hanging a stitch. That could happen to you. It's a lot to look at and it can be a confusing field of vision, but it's not a big deal. When I discovered my error, I just moved over the stitches in the correct order to make a space for the missed stitch and hung it, because everything was still safely hanging on my temporary needles, so there was no drop stitch and no big deal. You will see me discover the error at about 8 minutes and 30 seconds into the video. I'll point to it with the tool, and then I'll start moving stitches over to make room for the dropped stitch or the overlooked stitch to fit in where it ought to fit in. That's exactly what you would do if you had the same problem, and it's pretty likely that you will. There's a lot to look at, a complex field of vision. You can't be perfect, but you can fix it. Okay, the boo-boo is fixed. So now I can finish loading the stitches from both sides of the board and then slide out the temporary needles, give the work a downward tug to set the stitches, and give it one last check over to see anything that might need correcting before I continue knitting. You will recall that there are a lot of decreases along the edges of this work, and the decreases have become disarranged in the process of removing and rehanging, so I will need to restore them to the correct needles to make sure that my pattern is not disrupted. Also, I discover a couple of twisted stitches and simply lift each one off of the needle, untwist it, and rehang it. Whoops, another boo-boo. I see that a stitch fell off of the board closest to you, and the bar of it is stretched out, and you can tell that by seeing that the pattern is disrupted in the line that the yarn should be making back and forth between the needles. So I'm going to pick up the bar and rehang it where it belongs. Actually, I find two situations where that occurred, and I correct them both. Now we take a close look all the way down, looking for inconsistencies and oddities, And as your eye becomes trained, believe me, they will start to pop out to you. Although it may not look like it when you're a new knitter, the pattern will become something that you scan for with great ease. So you see, a mistake in your knitting doesn't have to be a disaster. Most of the time you can fix it. Bye now, and happy knitting.